Most nonprofits think grant writing is actually about writing. It's not. Grant writing is about proving you won't waste money. I'm Gretchen Villegas. I've raised over $3 million for nonprofits. I've seen organizations win grants that nearly destroyed them. I've also seen small groups get passed over because they didn't understand what funders actually look for. Here's what most people miss. Funders aren't reading your proposal to be inspired. They're reading it to decide if you're a safe bet. If you're new to grants, you probably think the hard part is actually writing a compelling story. That's not the hard part. The hard part is being ready before you ever open the application. In this video, I'm going to walk you through what grant readiness actually means. I'll show you how to find the right grants. I'll give you the writing principles that matter the most, and I'll explain what happens after you win, because there is life after the grant. And if you're not ready for it, winning can actually hurt you. Let's start with the thing no one tells beginners. Grant readiness is the gate, not the application. Most denials aren't about your writing. They're about signals that you cannot deliver. Funders are scanning for 5 things: compliance hygiene, operational coherence, governance credibility, financial narrative consistency, and program clarity. Let me break those down. Compliance hygiene means your filings are up to date. You're current with your state. You file your 990. You respond to anything the IRS sends you, and if you're not compliant, you're not eligible. Doesn't matter how good your story is. Operational coherence means you have clear programs, not ideas, actually programs. You know who you serve, you know what you do, and you know what outcomes you're trying to create. If a funder asks you to describe your program model and you can't do it in 3 sentences, you're not ready. Governance credibility means you have a real board, not a paper board, a board that actually meets, a board that oversees, and a board that actually holds you accountable. Funders want to know someone's watching their money. Financial narrative consistency means the budget actually makes sense. Your expenses align with your programs, your revenue sources are documented, and your cash flow story is perfectly clear. If your financials don't match your narrative, funders assume you don't know your numbers. Program clarity is the big one. This is where most beginners fail. You need to know your outcomes. You need to know your outputs. You need to know the difference between them. Outputs are what you do. Outcomes are what changes you create. If you can't articulate both, you're not ready to write a grant. Here's the truth. 80% of grant work happens before you type a single word. If you skip grant readiness, you'll waste time on applications you'll never win. Or worse, you'll win grants that actually hurt you in the long run. I once saw a nonprofit win a $5 million grant. It nearly broke them. On paper, it was a dream. In reality, it required them to stretch their operations. It forced them to run a program model they didn't design or understand, and it undercut the true cost of delivering the work. So when the grant ended, they had higher fixed costs. They had less diversified revenue, and they had to contract and downsize just to survive. That's what happens when you win money and you're not ready for it. So before you chase grants, do this. Audit your readiness. Ask yourself these questions. Are you compliant? Do you have clear programs? Do you have a functioning board? Are your financials clean? Can you articulate your outcomes? And if the answer to any of those is no, you need to fix that first. Now let's talk about finding grants. The number one question I get is, where do you find them? There are tools. Instrumental is one I use most. It's a research platform that saves us about 3 hours a week. You can also use GrantWatch, Grant Station, Grant Connect if you're in Canada. But here's what matters more than the tool. Need to know what you're looking for. Hey, this is Gretchen. If you liked what you heard today and you would like to learn more about building resilient financial organizations, you can find more value in the description below by clicking on the Nexus Impact Spotlight. There's lots of information that you can use and actually apply yourself today. Most beginners search by keyword, and that's fine, but it's not enough. You also need to filter by the actual fit. And here's what I mean by that. Every grant lead is not a grant partner. A grant partner is a funder whose values align with your own. A funder who funds organizations your size. A funder who offers general, operating, or multi-year support. And a funder whose reporting requirements are proportional to the actual award. If a funder requires 50 hours of reporting for a $5,000 grant, that's not a partner, that's a trap. So when you're researching, don't just look at eligibility, look at history, go to the funder's website, look at their past grantees, look at the size of awards they give, and look at how they talk about their work. Do they center community? Do they fund organizations led by people of color? Do they offer unrestricted funding? If their values don't align with yours, simply move on. I've told organizations not to apply for grants they were excited about, and here's why. I once worked with a nonprofit focused on regenerative agriculture. They found a large grant for climate innovation, and they were thrilled, but the grant required them to shift their language. It required them to build new programs, and it required them to hire consultants and create reporting systems they'd never used before. And I told them, don't apply, because winning that grant would have pulled them off their mission. It would have confused their partners. It would have weakened their positioning. And they didn't apply. And they stayed focused on what they do best. That's the discipline you need. Not every opportunity is your opportunity. Now let's talk about writing. Here's my number one tip. The clearer you are as an organization, the easier it is to write grants. If you don't know your program model, writing it will feel like pulling teeth. If you don't know your outcomes, you'll struggle with every question. But if you've done the readiness work, writing becomes simple. And here's how I approach it. First, I keep two audiences in mind, the community I serve and the funder I'm writing to. I'm client-centric. I tell the community story. I use their language. I center their experiences, but I'm also funder aware. I make sure my writing is clear. I make sure it's easy to read, and I make sure it answers every question they asked. Clarity is kind. If a funder has to work to understand you, they'll simply move on. Second, I use what I call a master grants library. This is a folder where I store every piece of content I've ever written. Program descriptions, budget narratives, logic models, impact data, board bios. 80% of most grants is about the same information. So I don't start from scratch every time. I pull from the library, I refine it, I tailor it to specific funder. It saves me hours of work. It also keeps my language consistent. And here's the bonus. If someone leaves your organization, the library stays with your organization, and you don't lose that institutional knowledge. Third, I focus on the who, what, when, where, and why. Every section of a grant should answer those questions. Who are you serving? What are you doing? When will it happen? Where will it happen? And why does it even matter? If you answer those clearly, you'll write a strong grant. Now, here's what experienced grant writers do that beginners think is lazy. We reuse language. Beginners think every proposal needs to be completely custom written. That's simply not true. If you have a clear core narrative, you should be able to answer it over and over. Reusing language is also a test of fit. If you have to rewrite everything to make your work sound different, the grant probably is not the right fit for your organization. I'd rather pass on a misaligned grant than reshape my organization to apply. Let me tell you what most beginners don't realize. Most grant proposals are never truly read by a human. I realized this the first time I watched a funder walk through their review process. They didn't start with a narrative. They started with a spreadsheet, okay? A spreadsheet. Proposals were sorted by eligibility, by geography, by budget size, by alignment. So before anyone read the writing itself, 70 to 80% of those proposals, they were eliminated. They were tossed out. And even when a reader opened a proposal, they were skimming through it. That's all they were doing. They were looking for confirmation, not discovery. So your job isn't to write a beautiful story. Your job is to survive the sorting system. That means meeting every single requirement. That means answering every question. That means making it easy for the reviewer to say yes and find your points. Now let's talk about what happens after you win. This is where most beginners stop thinking. They get the award letter, they celebrate, and they post on social media, but there's life after the grant, right? Grants are actually contracts. Everything you wrote in your proposal becomes legally binding. And if you said you'd serve 50 people, you have to serve 50 people. If you said you'd collect certain data, you have to collect it. And if you said you'd report every 6 months, you have to report every 6 months. Grant management is stewardship, it's accountability. You're accountable to the funder because that's what they bought. But more importantly, you're accountable to the community you'd said you'd serve. And here's what that looks like practically. You need to track revenue. You need to track expenses. You need to track outcomes. You need attendance sheets. You need surveys. You need pre and post data. And you need to read your grant agreement word for word. You need to know your milestones. You need to know your deadlines. And if something goes wrong, you need to communicate with your donor. I've had clients call funders to say enrollment is lower than expected. I've had clients ask for extensions because they won't spend the money and time. And that's completely normal, right? That's rational. Funders are your partners. They want you to succeed, but you have to manage the relationship. And here's what most nonprofits get wrong. They think the grant is actually the finish line when it's not. It's actually the starting point. If you manage a grant, you'll get more grants. If you manage it poorly, you won't get any more funding. Let me tell you a story. I worked with a small workforce nonprofit. They applied for a $1.5 million foundation grant. They had a strong writer. They had a tight proposal, but they didn't have grant readiness. They didn't have audited financials. They had weak data systems, and they had completely unclear ownership of outcomes. They won the grant, but to comply, they had to rush new hires. They had to build reporting systems just for that donor. They had to pull leadership away from core work. When the grant ended, the systems were abandoned. Staff were laid off. The organization was weaker than before, and the writing didn't fail them. Being unprepared did. So here's my advice. Don't chase grants just for the money. The biggest risk for first-time applicants is not rejection. It's contorting your mission. It's over-promising capacity, and it's building systems to serve the donor instead of your community. If a grant requires you to change who you are, it's not the right grant. Let me leave you with this. Grant writing isn't about persuasion. It's simply about proof. Proof that you know who you are. Proof that you know what you do. Proof that you can deliver. Proof that you can document. And proof that you won't waste money. If you can prove those things, you'll win grants. And if you manage them well, you'll win more grants. So start with readiness. Find the right partners, write clearly, manage carefully. That's the system. If you want to go deeper on grant strategy, watch the next video on this topic. I'll show you how to build a grant calendar that actually works.